As the United States expands and settles in the American West toward the close of the 19th century, the United States Cavalry begins, too, to expand and evolve. The abolition of slavery in the United States saw other countries following suit. In 1886, the island nation of Cuba abolishes slavery, and former enslaved men and women joined the workforce as farmers and other members of the working class. Still under Spanish rule, Cuba soon sees an influx of investment capital from the United States, thanks to their tobacco, sugar, and mining operations, to the tune of nearly $50 million. By 1895, labor unions have risen to prominence in the nation, and Cuban revolutionaries like José Martí begin to advocate for independence from Spain. While Martí gains much sympathy and support in the United States through political organizations and clubs across the country, he also recognizes the fact that if Cuba does not achieve independence, the United States may annex the land for its own. This belief is further anchored by the annexation plans for the island of Hawaii and the sentiments of Secretary of State James G. Blaine, who said,
"That rich island, the key to the Gulf of Mexico, is, though in the hands of Spain, a part of the American commercial system. If ever ceasing to be Spanish, Cuba must necessarily become American and not fall under any other European domination."
Though many in the United States push for American intervention in the Cubans' fight for independence, the country remains neutral, though the capture of ships smuggling weapons to the severely outgunned Cuban revolutionaries by U.S. Navy and Coast Guard inadvertently aids the Spanish in the fight. In January of 1898, a riot in Havana led the U.S. Consul General to wire Washington for aid, fearing for American lives in Cuba. The following month sees the battleship USS Maine, sent in response to the cable, destroyed by explosion, and yellow journalism from Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal only adds fuel to the fire of American anti-Spanish sentiment when it is initially reported that the Maine was sunk by a Spanish mine. On April 20th, 1898, the United States officially declared war on Spain.
Wood and I were speedily commissioned as Colonel and Lieutenant Colonel of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. This was the official title of the regiment, but for some reason or other, the public promptly christened us the Rough Riders. At first, we fought against the use of the term, but to no purpose. And when finally the generals of division and brigade began to write informal communications about our regiment as the Rough Riders, we adopted the term ourselves.
One of the voices calling for American involvement in the Cuban fight for independence was former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt is named second in command to Colonel Leonard Wood, chosen to lead the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, one of 3 units established by the United States Cavalry to assist in the war effort. As ordered by President William McKinley, cavalry volunteers are organized and trained in the southwestern states of Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas, reasoning that the soldiers from these areas will be well equipped to handle the similar climate in Cuba. The end of the American Civil War had seen a weakened military force in the United States, but McKinley's call to action inspires thousands to apply for a position. As Roosevelt says, the difficulty in organizing was not selecting, but rejecting men.
Harvard being my own college, I had such a swarm of applications from it that I could not take 1 in 10. What particularly pleased me, not only in the Harvard, but the Yale and Princeton men, and indeed in these recruits from the older states generally, was that they did not ask for commissions. With hardly an exception, they entered upon their duties as troopers, in the spirit which they held to the end, merely endeavoring to show that no work could be too hard, too disagreeable, or too dangerous for them to perform, and neither asking nor receiving any reward in the way of promotion or consideration.
Strong shooters and horsemen all, the volunteers are from a wide range of backgrounds. Former miners and prospectors, cowboys, Native Americans, hunters, gamblers, and retired police and military personnel, they were looking for a path to further adventure. Initially, they are led by Colonel Leonard Wood, and known colloquially and in the press as Wood's Weary Walkers. Despite the fact that they are a cavalry unit, much of their fighting and traveling was done on foot, engaging in hand-to-hand combat due to inadequate transportation and logistics while they were entering Cuba. Thanks to Roosevelt, who was, at first, Wood's lieutenant colonel, and soon the leader of the 1st Cavalry, the men are well equipped and armored. Through his connections as the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Roosevelt sees to it that the members of the 1st Volunteer Cavalry are outfitted with the finest gear and weaponry. The Rough Riders, as the press soon dubbed them, are given 1892 through 98 Springfield bolt-action rifles, Colt 45 revolvers, Bowie knives, and the best horse accoutrements and camping equipment. The unit is also equipped with 2 M1 985 Colt Browning machine guns, a 7mm Mauser caliber gas-operated tripod-mounted weapon. While the Rough Riders are issued the same quality and quantity of weaponry and supplies as the regular U.S. Army, their uniforms, by design, set the men apart. Roosevelt describes their choice of attire.
The Rough Rider uniform was a slouch hat, blue flannel shirt, brown trousers, leggings, and boots, with handkerchiefs knotted loosely around their necks. They looked exactly as a body of a cowboy cavalry should look.
By June of 1898, the 1st Volunteer Cavalry sees their first engagement with the Spanish in Cuba at the Battle of Las Guasimas. Weakened from their march and beset by disease and infection, still the cavalry marched. When Edward Marshall, a reporter who had been embedded with the Rough Riders and who had been inspired by the men around him to join the fight, was killed, many mistook him at long range for Colonel Wood. Hearing of Wood's supposed death, Roosevelt takes charge of the men and leads the cavalry to their first victory of the Spanish-American War. Later, it is revealed that Wood had survived, but General Joseph Wheeler, a veteran of the Civil War, had been stricken with illness, having been replaced by the 2nd Brigade's commander, Brigadier General Samuel S. Sumner, to take over his command. Wood assumed Sumner's former command of the 2nd Brigade as Brigadier General, and Roosevelt is promoted to colonel and tasked with leading the 1st unit. Roosevelt first leads the Rough Riders into the Battle of San Juan Hill, which will become a decisive victory for the Americans, but not by Roosevelt's hand alone. Initially, simply charged with holding a position at San Juan Hill, near a Spanish entrenchment, the Rough Riders marched 8 miles to the area with little to no plan of attack. The enemy entrenchments are on a hill dubbed Kettle Hill, and this position, and San Juan Hill are separated by a pond and a small valley called San Juan Heights by the Americans. While the 1st and 10th Infantry charge the trenches and blockhouse at San Juan Hill, they are assisted by the 10th Cavalry, also known as the Buffalo Soldiers, a cavalry division made up of African American cavalrymen. It is the 10th Cavalry that would later lead Roosevelt and his Rough Riders into battle at Kettle Hill. Roosevelt's troops provided support to the Buffalo Soldiers, and when it was thought that the Spanish, with a superior position and larger numbers, might claim victory in the battle, Lieutenant John H. Parker commands a trio of Gatling guns, firing over 18,000 .30 caliber Army rounds at the enemy. Sadly, the Buffalo Soldiers' contribution to the victory at San Juan Hill is ignored by the American press, but none of the cavalry or infantrymen would have claimed victory if it weren't for Parker's guns, as Roosevelt himself acknowledges.
I think Parker deserved rather more credit than any other one man in the entire campaign. He had the rare good judgment and foresight to see the possibilities of the machine guns. He then, by his own exertions, got it to the front and proved that it could do invaluable work on the field of battle, as much in attack as in defense.
The Gatling gun remains a crucial element in the support of not only the Rough Riders, but the whole of the United States Armed Forces deployed in Cuba. As the infantry and cavalry work to ensnare the city of Santiago, driving the Spanish Navy from the port and into a battle with the U.S. Navy, Roosevelt again credits the Gatlings as the linchpin of the entire U.S. military operation as he describes the Rough Riders' harrowing experience during the siege of Santiago, July 3rd through 17th, 1898.
When the shrapnel burst among us on the hillside, we made up our minds that we had better settle down to solid siege work. All of the men who were not in the trenches I took off to the right, back to the Gatling guns, where there was a valley, and dispersed them by troops in sheltered parts. It took us an hour or two's experimenting to find out exactly what spots were free from danger, because some of the Spanish sharpshooters were in trees in our front, where we could not possibly place them from the trenches. And these were able to reach little hollows and depressions where the men were entirely safe from the Spanish artillery and from their trench fire. Moreover, in one hollow, which we thought safe, the Spaniards succeeded in dropping a shell, a fragment of which went through the head of one of my men, who, astonishing to say, lived, although unconscious, for 2 hours afterward.
Again, while the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, or Rough Riders, are given much of the credit for the success in Cuba, the key forces fighting for the U.S. in the Spanish-American War are mostly comprised of the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers. Serving with the African-American fighters of the 10th as quartermaster is 1st Lieutenant John J. Pershing. John Joseph Pershing fights with the 10th Cavalry at Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill and is cited for gallantry, an honor that will later be upgraded to a Silver Star. Pershing is with the Buffalo Soldiers throughout the siege and surrender of Santiago. Born near Laclede, Missouri, a year before the American Civil War, Pershing's father, John Fletcher Pershing, would go on to work as a sutler for the 18th Missouri Volunteer Infantry, while his mother, Anne Elizabeth Thompson, would raise John and his 5 siblings. In 1878, after graduating high school, Pershing works for a few years as a teacher to African-American students in his hometown. 1882 sees Pershing applying to the United States Military Academy at West Point. In 1886, Pershing is assigned to Troop L of the 6th U.S. Cavalry and serves with the unit in New Mexico, California, Arizona, and North Dakota, participating in military actions to suppress Indian uprisings throughout the Southwest. In skirmishes with the Apache, Pershing earned a citation for bravery. 3 days after the massacre at Wounded Knee, Pershing and Troop L successfully ward off an attack on the 6th Cavalry's supply wagon, forcing Chief War Eagle and the Lakota tribe into retreat. After being promoted to first lieutenant in October of 1892, Pershing is assigned to command a troop of the 10th Cavalry, the regiment comprised of African-American cavalrymen known as Buffalo Soldiers. In 1897, the association with the Buffalo Soldiers earns Pershing the nickname Black Jack when he is appointed as an instructor at West Point. While the nickname is originally derisive and a result of Pershing's reputation as a strict instructor, the name remains with Pershing for the rest of his career. In the Philippines, after the Spanish-American War, between 1899 and 1913, U.S. forces are deployed to occupy the islands and establish relations with the indigenous Moro tribes, who had resisted both Spanish and American occupation. While many of the American soldiers who had served in the Indian Wars in the southwestern United States lived by the motto, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," and civilized them with a crag, Pershing, stationed in Iligan, pursues diplomatic and friendly relations with the Moros. The Moro people soon embrace Pershing's efforts towards peaceful coexistence in the Philippines.
The Sultan had a surprise for the American Army officer, however. With all the love of the Oriental for ostentation, he created Captain Pershing of the United States Army one of his datos. A dato of the Moro people is not only a prince, but he has certain religious and judicial duties which are very important in their eyes. Pershing had the unusual honor of being the first person not a Mohammedan to have this honor conferred upon him. He did not care particularly about the honor, but it gave him a certain prestige with the natives, of which he could make use in his capacity as governor of the province. The Moros had not recognized the authority of the United States to govern them. All officers entrusted with executive powers worked, therefore, at a disadvantage. Here was an officer, however, empowered by the United States to govern the natives, who at the same time was one of their own datos. Hereditary laws compelled their obedience to him, and they recognized his authority as their judge.
By 1916, Black Jack Pershing is made Major General. In January of that year, near Santa Isabel, Chihuahua, Mexico, a train is held up by revolutionaries under the order of Pancho Villa. Villa had given orders to attack the train in retaliation for a perceived betrayal on the part of the Americans, but reportedly ordered that no American blood be spilled. The Villistas, however, kill all but one American passenger, mostly employees of the American Smelting and Refining Company. The lone survivor gives the details to the press. Pancho Villa continues to build his army, soon commanding a militia of 500. In March of 1916, Villa ordered 100 of his men to attack the town of Columbus, New Mexico, and seize weapons, horses, and supplies from the 13th Cavalry Regiment stationed there. At 4 in the morning, March 9th, the raiders killed 10 civilians and 8 U.S. soldiers before absconding back to Mexico with horses, mules, machine guns, and ammunition. While the raid is technically a success for Villa's men, they don't escape without dozens of men wounded, over 60 dead, and 5 captured by American cavalrymen. The incident convinces the United States government that a mission into Mexico is necessary for the protection of not only innocents in Mexico, but now for the safety of its own people within U.S. borders. 6 days later, on March 19th, Major General John J. Pershing leads 4,800 troops into Mexico with orders from President Woodrow Wilson to bring back Pancho Villa, dead or alive. For nearly a year, the United States punitive expedition doggedly hunts for Pancho Villa, with cavalrymen fighting at many key locations in Chihuahua, Mexico, as well as back home in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. While the Battle of Carrizal proves to be a loss for the United States, as well as a strategic miscalculation, the fighting that takes place only strengthens the reputation of the troops of the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, who served in the skirmish. First Sergeant Vance Marchbanks remembers the battle, in particular, the actions of Cavalryman Sergeant Peter Bigstaff.
One of the outstanding heroes of the Carrizal engagement was my friend and comrade, Peter Bigstaff, who's now retired and lives in Lexington, Kentucky. He was at that time a sergeant in Troop C. A finer man or braver soldier never lived. A Southerner, John Temple Graves, a well-known writer and newspaper man, in the course of a tribute to the Carrizal fighters wrote, "The black trooper, Sergeant Bigstaff, might have faltered and fled a dozen times, leaving Adair to fight alone, but it never seemed to occur to him. He was a comrade to the last blow. When Adair's broken revolver fell from his hand, the black trooper pressed another into it, and together, shooting in defense, they turned the swooping circle of overwhelming odds before him. The black man fought in deadly shambles, side by side with the white man, following always, fighting always, as his lieutenant fought. And finally, when Adair, literally shot to pieces, fell in his tracks, his last command to his black trooper was to leave him and save his own life. Even then, the heroic Negro paused in the midst of that hell of courage for a final service to his officer. Bearing a charmed life, he'd fought his way out. He saw that Adair had fallen with his head in the water, and with superb loyalty, the black trooper turned and went back to the hailstorm of death, lifted the head of his superior officer out of the water, leaned his head against a tree, and left him there dead with dignity when it was impossible to serve him anymore. There is no finer piece of soldierly devotion and heroic comradeship in the history of modern warfare than that of Henry Adair and the black trooper who fought with him at Carrizal.
It seems that bad intelligence has led Pershing to believe that Villa can be captured at Carrizal, but the U.S. cavalry forces encounter Mexican army forces and ill-advisedly attack anyway. The American forces are driven back, in spite of the valiant effort by the 10th Cavalry, with 2 officers and 14 men killed. The punitive expedition also becomes the proving ground for a previously novel piece of equipment, the automobile. Several 3/4-ton 1915 GMC Model 15 trucks and motor cars for officers. While the experience proves to be a dry run for the use of automobiles in World War I, many harsh lessons are learned. The rough terrain proves too much to handle for the fledgling vehicles, as many of the GMC trucks are destroyed or abandoned over the 400-mile expedition into Mexico, unable to cope with sandy and muddy conditions. The personnel cars prove unreliable as well. While the vehicles brought with them still do not outperform the cavalry's horses and mules, much is learned about the kinds of logistics and support that will be needed to mount automobiles in a war effort, proving invaluable the following year when the United States becomes embroiled in the First World War. The GMC Model 16 and Model 16 AA's, the latter specially ordered by the U.S. Army, featured improvements that see the vehicles become more reliable and useful on the field of battle, especially for use of supporting aviation efforts and as field ambulances. as a pamphlet published by GMC states,
It is to the credit of the United States government that in every phase of preparation for the Great War, the utmost consideration was given to providing comfort for the soldiers, not only during the preparation term at the various encampments around the country, but in providing for their welfare on the field of battle. It is a source of much satisfaction to the General Motors Truck Company that the Medical Department of the United States Army found the GMC 3/4-ton chassis to meet the requirements of this very exacting service.
As the vehicles continue to improve, other tools of the trade are given enhancements, and a few standby pieces of equipment that are in current use, and some that will soon be in use, are honed and perfected by the man who gives these items their name.
A child starts locomotion by crawling, but on this account, do we discourage walking? The recruit flinches and blinks on first firing a gun, but he is certainly not encouraged to continue this practice. Why then should the ignorant swinging of a sword be indicative of its proper use? It is in the charge that the sword is particularly needful and, in fact, finds almost its whole application, and it is here that the point is of particular advantage in stimulating to the highest degree the desire of closing with the enemy and running him through.
In 1914, Major General Leonard Wood approves the publication and implementation of a manual of saber exercises to be used in conjunction with the cavalry's latest standard sword, the Model 1913 Cavalry Saber, commonly called the Patton sword, after the man who spurs its invention, Second Lieutenant George S. Patton. Patton devised the exercises and tips in his manual from experience. In the 1912 Olympic Games, Patton is chosen as the Army's entry into the first ever pentathlon, where Patton goes on to place 21st on the pistol range. But many reports say that Patton should have been placed much higher, as Patton used a .38 caliber pistol for his target shooting. Many were convinced that the holes in the target were so large and Patton's aim so good that many rounds passed through the same hole twice. The judges disagreed, and they hold their ruling that Patton's subsequent shots missed the target entirely. Patton accepted the ruling and later only commented,
The high spirit of sportsmanship and generosity manifested throughout speaks volumes for the character of the officers of the present day. There was not a single incident of a protest or any unsportsmanlike quibbling or fighting for points which I may say marred some of the other civilian competitions at the Olympic Games. Each man did his best and took what fortune sent them like a true soldier. And at the end, we all felt more like good friends and comrades than rivals in a severe competition. Yet this spirit of friendship in no manner detracted from the zeal with which all strove for success.
Patton is a gentleman on the field of sports as well as on the field of battle. While he remains humble about the shooting competition, the accomplished athlete goes on to place 7th in swimming, 6th in the equestrian competition, 3rd in the foot race, and 4th in fencing. After the Olympics, Patton studies fencing at the cavalry school in Saumur, France. A French master swordsman and instructor at the school, Adjutant Charles Clary, taught Patton well, and he not only returned to America with newly designed rules of engagement with combat sabers, but also with ideas for a newly designed weapon. During the punitive expedition to Mexico, Patton serves as a personal aide to John J. Pershing, and eventually is given command of Troop C of 13th Cavalry in the continuing effort to capture Pancho Villa and his fighters. On May 14, 1916, Patton leads a small force of about 12 men on a foraging mission in 3 Dodge touring cars. the convoy surprises and kills 3 of Pancho Villa's men. It was not only the beginning of Patton's fascination with and implementation of motorized vehicles in combat, but it was the surprise attack that was the first motorized battle in U.S. military history.
3,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you. Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake. Only the hardest blows can win against the enemy we are fighting. Invoking the spirit of our forefathers, the Army asks your unflinching support to the end that the high ideals for which America stands may endure upon the earth.
In 1917, the United States enters what is then called the Great War, a conflict that had been raging in Europe for nearly 3 years. Initially, no cavalry units are deployed, but the newly formed 15th Cavalry Division at Fort Sam Houston still winds up supporting the American military in Europe. The units comprising the 15th Cavalry are subsequently trained not in cavalry tactics, but in field artillery support. The newly dubbed 7th Field Artillery supported the regular U.S. Army as a part of the 1st Expeditionary Division, which is later designated as simply the 1st Division, part of the Allied Expeditionary Force in World War I. While the cavalry, for the most part, operates only in the United States during the First World War, a few storied leaders of the cavalry are now presented with the opportunity to lead soldiers overseas. Joining the American Expeditionary Forces once again as aide to General Blackjack Pershing is Captain George Patton. In May of 1917, Patton begins his campaign in Europe by overseeing the training of American troops in Paris before being stationed at Chaumont to act as an adjutant, overseeing the operations of the base. Patton finds the post dissatisfying, and while stationed at Chaumont, Patton begins to take an interest in a new form of motorized artillery, tanks. Pershing intended to place Patton in charge of an infantry battalion, but while in the hospital for jaundice, Patton meets Colonel Fox Connor, who convinces Patton to pursue his interest in tanks by establishing the American Expeditionary Forces Light Tank Corps and attending the French Army's tank training school. Patton gains more experience than any other soldier by driving a Renault FT light tank and studying the results of one of the first large-scale battles to use tanks, the British-led offensive at Cambrai, France. Soon after Patton established his tank corps, he is promoted to general and receives the first 10 tanks as they are delivered to the tank school in Langres, France, in March of 1918. Because Patton was the only soldier with experience driving tanks, the general himself personally drove 7 of the tanks off of the train on which they had arrived. At Langres, Patton is in charge of not only training infantrymen to become tank crews, but promoting the use of tanks themselves. At first, the infantry is reluctant to adopt the tank for warfare. But by the end of the Great War, however, the United States Army is more than convinced. Patton goes on to lead tank brigades into battle at Saint-Mihiel, the first battle that sees American tank units, and also into Essay and Pan. At some of the battles, Patton is so confident in the tank's power that the now lieutenant colonel either led the tanks on foot into the fields of battle or rode exposed on the tops of the machines. His orders are that no tank is to ever be surrendered. Supporting the U.S. First Corps in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in late September 1918, Patton is wounded in an attack on German machine guns stationed near Chepi, and continues to command his troops from a hole left in the battlefield by tank shells until he's evacuated. Patton, however, refuses admittance to the hospital before he can give his briefing to a rear command post. For his actions at Shepi, Patton is promoted to colonel and given the Distinguished Service Medal, and later a Purple Heart after that medal was instated in 1932. The wound sidelines Patton for the rest of the Great War, but the tanks roll on. As World War I reaches armistice, the United States and other allies continue to develop their tank technology and construction, with the U.S. building and experimenting with light and medium-sized tanks. In the period between World Wars I and II, the cavalry, and indeed the whole of the American armed forces, undergoes massive restructuring. In 1921, the Army establishes a permanent cavalry division and lays out tables of organization and equipment on April 21st. The newly formed 1st Cavalry Division was in fact merely an amalgam of previously established units, some dating back to before the American Civil War. As an official 1st Cavalry history explains, the division's roots date back to 1855, when the 2nd Cavalry Regiment was organized. Redesignated as the 5th Cavalry in 1861, this unit participated in a number of famous Civil War engagements, including Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, Wilderness, and Appomattox. The sound of the bugle and the cry of "Charge!" sent the thundering hooves of U.S. cavalry troopers to protect the western-bound settlers in an era when Indians roamed the western frontier and pioneering settlers clung to their land with determination and luck. As the previously established regiments come together, headquartered at Fort Bliss, Texas, and Douglas, Arizona, both old, such as the 5th Cavalry, and new, such as the 15th Cavalry, are reorganized into a square division consisting of headquarters, 2 cavalry brigades, a field artillery battalion, an engineer battalion, quartermaster trains command, special troops command, and an ambulance corps. In September of 1921, the Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry are transferred into the 1st Cavalry Division, but Jim Crow laws of the time prevented black and white soldiers from serving in the same units. The 10th were soon replaced by the 5th Cavalry Regiment. As the cavalry and the rest of the military undergo an overhaul, the use of cavalry tactics and practices make their way into other branches of the armed forces. Initially part of the Quartermaster Corps, the U.S. Army Remount Service breeds, trains, and provides horses for all cavalry and U.S. Army units that require them, first starting to systematically breed horses for the cavalry in 1918.
The mission of the Remount Service is as follows. A. The purchase of horses and mules and forage for the Army. B. The care, conditioning, and training of remounts after purchase and before issue. C. The distribution and issue of remounts. D. Organization and operation of the Remount Service. E. The training, allocation, and assignment of Remount Service personnel operating under the control of the Quartermaster General. And F. The operation of the Army Horse Breeding Plan.
The Remount Service traces its roots, however, to the American Civil War, where 2 organizations are established for the furnishing of horses, one to the cavalry and one to field artillery. The organizations are not adequately staffed or led, leading to many problems with not only training of the horses, but corruption and command stability. Activated in 1908, changes were made not only in processing and distribution of the horses and mules, but an effort is also made to enlist breeders and sellers themselves as an official element of the service. Thoroughbred, Arabian, Morgan, saddlebreds, Anglo-Arabians, and Cleveland Bay breeds of horses are all successfully bred and trained through 1945. Several remount depots were established in Nebraska, Texas, Montana, Oklahoma, California, Louisiana, and Virginia. By 1944, however, the number of remount outposts is reduced to 6, as the advent of automobiles and tanks lessen the need of horses and mules by the military. As the United States military comes of age during the years leading up to World War II, it is increasingly clear that the days of the mounted cavalrymen are numbered. Before the United States entered World War II, the cavalry's units were designated as either horse-mounted or mechanized. As the war raged on, the mechanized units all ultimately reveal themselves as the future of the United States Cavalry. The final horse-mounted cavalry charge takes place on June 16, 1942. Fighting Japanese forces in the Patton Peninsula, in the Philippines, the 26th Cavalry Regiment enters battle with the Japanese in the village of Morong. The fighting devastates the American and Philippine forces, and tragically, the 26th Cavalry must resort to slaughtering their horses for food. The beleaguered unit continues fighting and foraging on foot, scavenging supplies, weapons, and vehicles until they are forced to surrender to the enemy. A 1966 notice in the weekly Washington, D.C. newspaper, The Pentagram, profiles a distinguished member of the United States Cavalry and one who had served with the African-American soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, more specifically, a cavalry horse named Chief.
March 24, 1966. Chief, the last living cavalry horse still carried on government rolls, was foaled in 1932 and purchased by the Army in 1940 at Fort Robertson, Nebraska. In December of 1949, he was placed in semi-retirement and was fully retired at Fort Riley, Kansas in 1958. In the event of his death, Chief will be buried with full military honors adjacent to Old Trooper, the cavalry monument on Main Post. Chief, the last remaining government-owned cavalry horse, is currently in retirement at Fort Riley, Kansas. Though the days of the horse cavalry have long since passed, this horse remains on the Army rolls. Foaled in 1932, the Bay entered the Army 8 years later, exactly 1 year and 12 days prior to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He arrived at his cavalry post, Fort Riley, Kansas, on April 3, 1941, where he was assigned to the 10th Cavalry and later the 9th Cavalry. In June of 1942, Chief was transferred to the Cavalry School and remained on the post until his retirement.
The Army had experimented with regiments that were both horse-mounted and mechanized, but World War II proves that the advantages lie in cavalry tank and artillery brigades. Mechanized cavalry units are each equipped with 6 Bantam Jeeps, 3 of which are armed with mounted 60mm mortars, and the other 3 mounted with 30 or 50 caliber machine guns. The units are also outfitted with 3 M8 Greyhound armored cars, a 6-wheeled lightweight armored vehicle with a 37mm gun, mounted in a 360-degree capable turret. The Greyhounds were also equipped with powerful FM radios, ensuring superior battlefield communications for the Allies. Light tank units are comprised of a total of 17 tanks. First, an M3 Stuart, then with M5 Stuarts. The tanks, like the M8s, housed 37mm guns and were fast and maneuverable. However, the armor plating process proves inadequate against German tanks, prompting all Stuarts to be replaced with M24 Chaffee light tanks sporting 75mm guns. The successes and failures of the armored cavalry divisions provide trial-by-fire data for the United States military. Soon, the American Armed Forces would begin incorporating armored and tank cavalry units to support almost all other branches of the military. Not only does the cavalry continue to improve upon its own tactics and technology, but we have seen the cavalry successfully integrate itself in some form with other units across many branches of the United States military. From the remount service to tank battalions, cavalry service to the American military will soon extend to air cavalry, first being deployed during the conflict in Vietnam. Beyond the technology of warfare, great leaders like Generals Pershing and Patton have risen through the ranks to become some of the most powerful and effective leaders in the United States military history. And Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became the leader of the free world in 1901 when President William McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt went on to serve 2 more terms as president in his own right, continuing to not only command with the highest honor, but to capture the imagination of the American people, much as he had done during his service with the U.S. Cavalry leading his Rough Riders. We will explore new innovations, new hopes, and new leaders who rise as we continue with the history of the United States Cavalry.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.